Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 88th deck and it's titled It's All Ogre Now. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the actual deck tech, I just want to take a second to highlight some of our social media accounts, some of the ways you can follow us, check us out, and of course, support the channel. So you can find us over on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13, email dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. All three of those locations are great ways to reach out to us if you ever have any questions, if you just want to talk about some of the decks, or just chat in general. I'm always happy to respond. And you can also head on over to our TCG Player affiliate link, which is in the description of this video. Once you've clicked on that link, any cards you purchase from their website, we get a little bit of a kickback from as a thank you for sending some customers their way. And finally, the most direct way that you can help support us is patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. Right now, I am working on getting supplies to record in-person games. I would love to have some in-person Commander and more on a personal level. I would love to start doing a little bit more Pioneer content as well, because that's one of my favorite formats. So all of that money right now is going toward that. And of course, you do get some great benefits from the Patreon as well. You also get access to the deck lists a week early. You get access to a Discord channel where we actually brew up some of the decks and where we actually play some of the decks. So if you want to participate in some of the games, that is a great way to do it. You'll also get the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear all of the players talking and their commentary rather than just my own narration. And finally, I will send you one of our random cards every single month as a thank you for your continued support. So if that is something that you are interested in doing, you can join our current phenomenal patrons of William Swiftfoot, Eric Hui, Doodle, and Calvin Schmidt. So to the four of you, thank you all so much. And I suppose with all of that out of the way, we can jump on into our deck tech. So first up, we got to talk about our random card of the week, which is suggested by Scowan on Patreon or Discord. That's Calvin. He's a great guy. So obviously he's going to have an amazing suggestion for us. And this week, no exception, we have Yidris Maelstrom Wielder. So Yidris is blue, black, red, green for a 5/4 legendary creature, Ogre Wizard. Trample. Whenever Yidris deals combat damage to a player, as you cast spells from your hand this turn, they gain Cascade. So, as an unspoken rule for the channel, if we ever get a legendary creature as our commander, it of course has to be the commander. So, Yidris is going to be leading up our deck this week. And I'm not going to lie, when I first sat down to make this deck, I really had no idea what I was doing, because I could build a Cascade deck, but that just kind of felt too on the nose. Could try to build wizards, but we've done wizards before. Could try to do something with his trample and maybe like a Trample Matters style deck. And eventually I just kind of thought, how many ogres are actually in Magic the Gathering? And the answer is, there's quite a few. I'm not going to lie though, there's not a lot of great ones. There's some very good ones, but there's not a ton of great ones. So let's talk about our themes and then we'll get more into that. So as I've already mentioned, our first theme is ogres. We got to make sure that we are playing as many ogres as possible. We got little ogres, we got big ogres, we've got everything that makes ogres. Well, maybe not everything. We did have to cut some ogres because like I said, there's a ton of them. But we have cards like Ogre Marauder, which is 1 black for a 3/1 Ogre Warrior. Whenever Ogre Marauder attacks, it can't be blocked this turn unless defending player sacrifices a creature. This is one of our smaller ogres, but it's nice just to kind of get in there, make our opponents either sacrifice a creature or do a ton of damage. So Ogre Marauder, very good. Unfortunately, though, there really aren't any ogre tribal cards. There's nothing that says like, oh, all ogres get +1/+1 or anything like that. So there's no real payoff for being ogres other than the fun of it. So our next theme kind of helps us out with that, because our next theme is going to be cards that are just generically powerful in a tribal deck. There's cards that care about cards that share a creature type, but they don't necessarily care about those specific creature types. So for example, we have Stoneforge Masterwork, which is 1 mana for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each other creature you control that shares a creature type with it. and it has equip for 2. So basically, if we have 5 ogres in play, we can equip the Stoneforge Masterwork to one of these ogres, and they'll get +4/+4 because each of our other ogres pumps it up by 1. So that could turn even Ogre Marauder into a massive 7-power creature. So Stoneforge Masterwork can make any of our ogres into lethal threats, even though most of them are already quite large as it is, and there's plenty of ways for us to kind of sneak through some damage. So we have a bunch of different cards that do very similar things or care about a creature type without saying a specific creature type because, as I mentioned, there's no ogre support. And then that leads us to our final theme of the deck, and that is going to be cards that care about the power of our creatures. As I mentioned before, a lot of our ogres tend to be pretty big just on their own. So when we've got cards like Garruk's Uprising, which is 2 and a green for an enchantment, when Garruk's Uprising enters the battlefield, if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, draw a card. Creatures you control have trample, and whenever a creature with power 4 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. So the vast majority of our ogres are all 4 power or greater. So we are going to need a steady source of card draw to keep casting these giant creatures. Garruk's Uprising gives us exactly that. We can get a ton of creatures, play them, draw some cards, play more creatures, and keep going. This is also incredibly relevant because it's going to give our creatures trample. Most of our creatures don't have trample naturally, but are very large, so we'd like to make sure that they can get through the tiny little 1/1s that could block them, and make sure that we're actually pushing through some damage. So, a bunch of cards that care about ogres, care about, well, I say ogres, but they care about a creature type, and we're going to pick ogres, and then cards that care about large creatures. So those are the themes that we're working with this week. And then the next thing we've got to do for our deck tech is talk a little bit about some key cards, some cards that synergize very well with what we're doing. The first of those key cards is going to be Kindred Discovery. Like I mentioned, we want to make sure we are drawing as many cards as possible. Kindred Discovery is going to help us do that. Kindred Discovery is 3 blue for an enchantment. As Kindred Discovery enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Spoiler, it's going to be ogres. And whenever a creature you control of the chosen type enters the battlefield or attacks, draw a card. The specific line that says or attacks is very, very important because we are an aggressive style strategy. A lot of ogres care about combat, they care about attacking, so we want to make sure that we can attack, draw some cards, play some more ogres, draw some more cards, and just keep the train rolling. Next up, our next key important card is going to be Ruric Thar the Unbowed. And Ruric Thar is 4 red-green for a 6/6 legendary creature ogre warrior. Vigilance, reach, Ruric Thar attacks each combat if able, and whenever a player casts a non-creature spell, Ruric Thar deals 6 damage to that player. Now, notably, because we are a creature-centered deck, we have a ton of ogres, we have a ton of things that care about ogres. Most of the cards in our deck are going to be creatures. And because we're an aggressive style strategy, we don't really care if we have to take 6 damage to cast our Kindred Discovery, because then we get to attack our opponents with like 5 4/4s. So we can make sure that we can pressure our opponent's life totals more than they can pressure ours, and get them to the point where casting any non-creature spell is almost going to be lethal. So Ruric Thar really helps us put the pressure on our opponents, and really helps us make sure that whatever our opponents are doing is going to at least cost them a little bit of life. And that leads us to our final key card, and that is going to be Kindred Charge. So 2 of the Kindred cards showing up on here. We actually have the green one in here as well. But Kindred Charge is 4 red for a sorcery. Choose a creature type. For each creature you control of the chosen type, create a token that's a copy of that creature. Those tokens gain haste. Exile them at the beginning of the next end step. So, like I've already mentioned, we are an aggressive deck. We have a ton of big creatures. So if we have, say, 5 4/4s in play, and we cast Kindred Charge, now all of a sudden we have 10 4/4s in play. That's enough to kill someone from their starting life total. So Kindred Charge is incredibly strong and can kind of get our opponents out of nowhere if they're not expecting it. because not only are a lot of our ogres going to have attack style strategies, but a lot of them also have enter the battlefield effects, which will be triggered by Kindred Charge, making token copies of them. So Kindred Charge is an absolute all-star in this deck and really does everything we want to be doing. But those are our key cards. The next piece of this is to take a look at some cool interactions, some cards that work very well together. This first one is going to be between Heartless Hidetsugu and Seize the Day. And this might not look immediately relevant, but I'll explain it a little bit. So Heartless Hidetsugu is 3 red for a 4/3 Ogre Shaman, can tap and deal damage to each player equal to half that player's life total rounded down. So if you're at 40, you go to 20. If you're at 20, you go to 10. 10, you go to 5. 5, you go to 2, and so on. Seize the Day is going to be 3 and a red for a sorcery that says untap target creature. After this main phase, there is an additional combat phase followed by an additional main phase, and it has flashback for 2 and a red. The key to this is that if we cast Heartless Hidetsugu, we have to wait a turn until it can tap, obviously, and then we have 7 mana, we can cast Seize the Day, and then flashback Seize the Day, meaning that we can go to combat, tap Heartless Hidetsugu, we don't even have to attack, we just tap Heartless Hidetsugu, make each player lose half their life total, then we cast Seize the Day, we untap Heartless Hidetsugu, we do it again, we tap it again, we make them lose half their life total again, then we flash back Seize the Day, we untap Heartless Hidetsugu again, and we make everyone lose half their lives again. And at this point, we have really trimmed down on, well, I would say our opponent's life totals, but it's ours as well, so everybody's life totals. But we have big creatures. We can then kind of chip in for the last bit of damage, start knocking people out, and being able to drop someone, if we activate Heartless Hidetsugu 3 times, from their starting life total, they go from, like I said, 40 to 20 to 10, then down to, I think, 5 at that point. So we could drop the entire table from 40 life to 5 life in just 1 turn with these 2 cards. And that is incredibly powerful when, again, we have a ton of trample creatures. We've got a big bunch of 4/4s and 5/5s and things that can get through that last bit of damage. So even though Seize the Day gives us additional combat steps, we may not actually need them with Heartless Hidetsugu. But that is cool interaction number 1. Cool interaction number 2 is going to look a little bit weird, so let me explain this one to you as well. This is going to be the Beamtown Bullies and Obeka Brute Chronologist. So the Beamtown Bullies is 1 black, red, green for a 4/4 legendary creature, Ogre Devil Warrior. It has Vigilance, Haste, and tap. Target opponent whose turn it is puts target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard onto the battlefield under their control. It gains Haste, goad it, and at the beginning of the next end step, exile it. Now, because Obeka is legendary, the Beamtown Bullies cannot put Obeka into play under our opponent's control. Obeka, however, can make sure that our opponents get to keep the card that we gave them. So, Obeka Brute Chronologist is 1 blue, black, red for a 3/4 legendary creature, Ogre Wizard. Tap, the player whose turn it is may end the turn. So we could put any creature into play under our opponent's control with the Beamtown Bullies. It's going to gain haste, it's going to be goaded, and at the beginning of the next end step, we exile it. However, when we go to our end step, or I suppose when our opponents go to their end step, we can then tap Obeka and give our opponents the opportunity to actually keep that creature, because the exile triggers on the stack, and if we end the turn with it on the stack, then our opponents get to keep that creature forever, which not only means that they get to keep it, but I believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not 100% sure on this, but I believe that it remains goaded as well. So that means that that creature gets to stay goaded, they get to stay under our opponent's control, and now if they die, they go back into our graveyard and we can do it again. So this is a great way to kind of curry some favor, make sure that our opponents have a creature that maybe they want, or make sure that it's just not coming at us. We can send that creature somewhere else because it is goaded. It cannot attack us. So that is what I think is a cool interaction. And like I said, please correct me if I'm wrong. I think it remains goaded, but I'm not 100% sure with the way that it's worded. So With all of that out of the way, though, we've gotten through our cool interactions, we've gotten through the vast majority of the deck tech. Finally, we have to take a look at the price of this deck. And this week, the price came out to be $92.93, with our most expensive card, this is going to sound kind of weird, being kind of one of the worst cards in our entire deck, because our most expensive card is Tomb of Orami, which is almost $7 for a legendary land that taps to add a black to your mana pool, but it does a damage to you if you don't control an ogre. Hopefully we'll have an ogre, but you never know. And you can pay 4 mana, tap it, sacrifice all lands you control, and put a 5/5 Demon Spirit token flying named Orami into play. That is not great. That is what we might call underwhelming. So Tomb of Orami is really only in here because it is one of the few cards that actually cares about ogres in the deck. So I didn't want to leave it out. But it doesn't care about ogres in a good way. It's more of like it punishes you if you don't have ogres. And then you can also just pay essentially 5 mana, because it has to tap itself with the 4 mana, to put a single 5/5 into play and get rid of all your lands. So unless you are like ready to win the game, like this is going to win you the game, you never want to activate this ability, because a 5/5 is not worth getting rid of all your lands for. But it's in the deck because it cares about ogres. So if you want to cut it and put in just like a basic swamp, that's honestly probably going to make the deck better, but I thought it was fun, so I included it. On the other hand, though, if we're looking at cards to include in the deck that actually do improve it, but are out of budget, I do have a suggestion for you there. So the only card this week that I would recommend putting into this deck is going to be Savage Beating. And Savage Beating is a massive $20, and it's 3 red for an instant. Play Savage Beating only during your turn and only during combat. Choose one. Creatures you control gain double strike until end of turn, or untap all creatures you control, and after this phase there is an additional combat phase, or you can entwine this for 1 and a red, which means that for 7 mana you can actually get both of these abilities. You can get double strike and an additional combat step. Again, because all of our ogres are 4 power or greater, well, not all of them, but most of them are 4 power or greater, this can essentially just take out multiple players at a time. Because if we have 2 4/4s that would do 8 damage total, but are now going to do 16 damage, then untap and do 16 more damage, we just turned our 8 possible damage into 32 damage just with Savage Beating. So that is incredibly powerful and can close out a game very, very quickly, and it still plays into the actual strategies of what the deck is trying to do. Now, the card that I would recommend replacing is actually going to be kind of in a similar vein to Tomb of Orami. It's Ukora the Prisoner. And Ukora the Prisoner is 2 black for a 5/5 legendary creature, Demon Spirit. When Ukora the Prisoner leaves play, sacrifice all non-ogre creatures you control. Once again, this isn't in here because it's a good card. It is, in fact, quite a bad card because it's just a 4 mana 5/5, which is not good. But it's one of the few cards in Magic the Gathering that actually says the word ogre in the actual text of the card. It cares about ogres. Even if it cares about them in a very weird way, I wanted to include it more for flavor purposes than anything else. But if you are looking to actually improve the deck and make it perform better, I would recommend swapping in Savage Beating, because that just ends the game. So that is the end of our actual deck tech. The last thing we're going to have to do is see how this deck performs in a game. So we are going to run this deck up against 3 opponents this week, and we're going to find out if the ogres can get there in the end. So to start with, we got to talk about our opponents, of course. So we have Bilal playing Dalsum, Pliable Pacifist. We have Jason playing Vega the Watcher, and we have Shawn playing Yuriko the Tiger's Shadow. So starting off with Bilal's Dalsum deck, this is a life gain style strategy. He's not really playing into the reach aspect of it. He wants to just draw a ton of cards, gain a ton of life, and eventually just kind of outvalue his opponents in the sense that they just can't kill him. So a very Bilal style of deck, but I'm very interested to see how it plays. This is my first time playing against Dalsum. And then next up we have Jason's Vega the Watcher deck, which is a bit of a foretell card. It's got a bit of a flashback theme to it. He just basically wants to cast spells from anywhere other than his hand so he can continue to draw cards. So it's a little bit of a control strategy, but it's also just value, kind of similar to Dalsum, that he just wants to accrue a ton of value. And then finally we have Shawn's Yuriko deck. And Yuriko is very different than the other two. It's not really about drawing cards. It's not really about a ton of value. It's about getting a ton of little 1/1s into play and then hitting your opponents, revealing massive spells from the top of your library, like the meld spells or the flip spells or the whatever they might be kind of spells that are like 8+ mana. So that way he can do a ton of damage to all of his opponents at any one time. So I think in the short term, the deck that I am the most concerned about is Yuriko. I think that if Shawn can get off to a fast start, Yuriko is going to be a big problem. But I think in the late game, I'm a little more concerned about what Dalsum and Vega are doing. I'm not 100% sure which one I would say is the most threatening, but I think the life gain from Dalsum and the control from Vega is going to make them both decks to watch once we get into the late game. So hopefully our ogres can just kind of push through the life gain, push through the control, and deal with the ninjas. So we'll see how it goes. Hopefully it goes in our favor. But as always, if you've liked the deck tech so far, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's check out this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Bilal goes first, followed by myself, Jason, and then Shawn. On Bilal's first turn, he plays a forest. I play a Cinderglade. Jason plays an island. Shawn plays an island and casts Slitherblade, which can't be blocked. Bilal plays a Plains and casts Incubation Druid. I play an Exotic Orchard. Jason plays a Command Tower and casts Ominous Seas, which gets a counter whenever he draws a card and allows him to make an 8/8 Kraken token by removing 8 counters from it. Shawn plays a Drowned Catacomb and then attacks me with Slitherblade, and before damage, ninjutsus in his commander Yuriko, doing 1 damage to me and revealing the top card of his library, putting it to hand, and doing 0 damage to each opponent since the mana value of the revealed card was 0. Bilal plays a Bountiful Promenade and casts his commander Dalsum Pliable Pacifist. Unfortunately on my turn I can't find a third land, so I discard to hand size and pass. When Jason draws for his turn, he puts a counter on Ominous Seas, and then plays a Plains and casts Monk Class, making his second spell each turn cost 1 less to cast. This then lets him cast Azorius Signet for only 1 mana. Shawn plays an island and attacks me for 1 with Yuriko, again revealing a land when she does damage, doing 0 damage to all his opponents. Then in his second main phase, he casts Wishclaw Talisman and recasts Slitherblade. Bilal plays a Plains and attacks me for 1 with Dalsum, untapping him when he attacks since he has reach, and also drawing a card when he deals combat damage. On my turn, I cycle Viscera Dragger, but still can't find a land, so I once again discard to hand size and pass. When Jason draws for his turn, he puts a counter on the Seas, and then plays an Opal Palace before casting his commander Vega the Watcher, allowing him to draw a card whenever he casts a spell from anywhere other than his hand, and then he foretells a card and passes. Shawn plays a Command Tower and activates Wishclaw Talisman, removing a counter from it to search his library for a card, put it into his hand, and give control of the talisman to an opponent, in this case, me. Shawn then casts what he tutored for, a Scroll Rack, allowing him to swap any number of cards from his hand with cards on top of his library. He then moves to combat, attacking me for 1 with Yuriko and Bilal for 1 with Slitherblade. After the damage, but before Yuriko's ability resolves, Shawn activates Scroll Rack to swap a card in his hand with the top of his library, and this lets him reveal the card he just put on top, consign to Oblivion, putting it into his hand, and doing 7 damage to each opponent. At the end of turn, Bilal adapts Incubation Druid, putting 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Bilal plays a Forest and casts the Great Henge, which gains him 2 life whenever it's tapped, puts a +1/+1 counter on any creature that enters under his control, and also draws him a card when a creature enters under his control. He then casts Suture Priest, gaining a +1/+1 counter, drawing a card, and allowing him to gain a life whenever a creature enters under his control, as well as make an opponent lose a life whenever a creature enters under their control. He moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 1 with Dalsim, untapping him and drawing a card. On my turn, I activate the Wishclaw Talisman, searching my library for a card, putting it into my hand, and then passing the talisman to Jason. Then I play a Swamp and cast Farseek, searching my library for an island, putting it into play tapped. When Jason draws for his turn, he puts a counter on Ominous Seas, and then plays a Meandering River, moves to combat, attacking Shawn for 2 with Vega, and then in his second main phase, Jason also activates the Wishclaw Talisman, searching his library for a card, putting it to hand, and then passes the talisman, with no counters left on it, to Bilal. Shawn casts a Felwar Stone, and then attacks Bilal for 1 with Slitherblade and me for 1 with Yuriko. Before damage, Shawn ninjutsus in Moon Circuit Hacker, returning Slitherblade to his hand, losing a life, doing 2 damage to Bilal, drawing a card, and then activating Scroll Rack in response to Yuriko's trigger, putting a card on top of his library. This allows him to reveal Consigned to Oblivion and an island, doing an additional 7 damage to each opponent. Then, in his second main phase, he plays an island and casts Universal Automaton and recasts Slitherblade, losing 2 total life. At the end of turn, Bilal taps the Great Henge to gain 2 life. On Bilal's turn, he casts God Eternal Oketra, but Jason has the answer, casting Saw It Coming from Fortell to counter the spell and draw him a card with Vega. He then casts Auriok Champion, drawing a card, gaining a life, and putting a +1/+1 counter on it. This also lets him gain a life whenever any creature enters the battlefield. He then casts Righteous Valkyrie, drawing a card, gaining 2 life, and putting a +1/+1 counter on it. This allows him to gain life equal to the toughness of any angel or cleric that enters under his control. He moves to combat, attacking Jason for 1 with Dalsim, untapping him and drawing a card. On my turn, I cast my commander, Yidris Maelstrom Wielder, losing a life while Bilal gains a life. When Jason draws for his turn, he puts a counter on Ominous Seas, and then casts Return to Dust, exiling the Great Henge and Scroll Rack. In response though, Shawn casts Force of Negation, exiling Consigned to Oblivion from his hand to counter the removal spell. Then Jason foretells a card, attacks Shawn for 2 with Vega, and then passes the turn. Shawn plays a Zhalfirin Void, scrying 1, and casts Scheming Symmetry, allowing himself and I to both search our libraries for a card and put it on the top of our decks. He then casts Tetsuko Umizawa, making any of his creatures with 1 power or toughness unblockable. He moves to combat, attacking Bilal with all of his unblockable creatures for 5 total damage, triggering Yuriko 3 times when they do damage. In response to the triggers, Shawn activates Scroll Rack, swapping 2 cards in his hand with the top of his library. This then lets him reveal Treasure Cruise, Shadow of Mortality, and Grazilax Illithid Scholar, doing a total of 26 damage to each opponent, knocking everyone out and winning Shawn the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Unfortunately, we really got stuck on our lands and we couldn't do too much. Jason also similarly really didn't do much. He was able to do a little bit of controlling, but he didn't make it to the late game. Bilal was starting to go off. The Great Henge had a ton of life gain. I think if he'd had a couple more turns, Bilal probably would have wound up winning that one. But Shawn being able to get Scroll Rack for Yuriko early on really made the difference because he was able to keep flipping just 8 mana spells off the top, and finally that last turn where he was able to kind of interrupt Yuriko's triggers to reveal cards from the top and then activate Scroll Rack, put more stuff on the top, reveal more stuff off the top that did even more damage, meant that he was able to do about 26 damage that last turn, which is super, super powerful and not something that anybody really expected. So a very powerful showing for Yuriko. Hopefully, if this is a deck that you are interested in picking up, the Yidris deck, it's not going to be quite as, messed up with the lands. Hopefully you'll actually draw some lands, but you never quite know. So best of luck to anyone who tests this deck out. Please let me know if there's any suggestions you think would be good for this deck or good for future decks. If you have suggestions for cards that you'd like to see turned into decks, please do let me know in the comments or send them to me on any social media account. But I suppose that brings us to the actual end of our deck tech, our gameplay. Like I said earlier, if you did like it, please do like the video, subscribe to the channel. It does help out quite a bit. But With all of that being said, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.